Gorgeous, thank you. So thank you very much for Julie and for Karen of the introduction, and for inviting me to give you this talk today. So we procrastinated a lot about the title, but in the end we decided that we would select this one, and that is, what and how are we telling parents about what we know about mortality and morbidity in extremely preterm infants? And I will apologise in advance because some of you will have heard some segments of this talk in other forums, but today I'm bringing together a whole lot of information for you. So I don't need to tell this audience that when we are counselling parents and making decisions or shared decision making for extremely preterm babies, that involves some very important clinical decisions. Whether or not you administer antenatal corticosteroids, for example, at 22 weeks, whether you administer magnesium sulfate for fetal neuroprotection, whether or not you transfer the mother in utero to a tertiary perinatal centre that has a NICU, how you birth that baby. Do you do a classic caesarean section at 22 weeks, knowing the implications that has for a woman's future pregnancy? Or do you deliver the baby vaginally? Do you offer resuscitation at birth? And what form of resuscitation? Do you draw the line at chest compressions and adrenaline? Or do you say, if we're going to resuscitate, then we will provide any measure that is indicated at the birth? And then, of course, whether or not you admit that baby to a neonatal intensive care unit. And we certainly all agree, I hope, that there has been a big emphasis, and still is, importantly, on shared decision-making with the parents regarding whether or not to provide or withhold these life-saving interventions prior to the birth of their baby. We certainly know that if parents opt for active care at these very early gestations, and I'm talking about babies born below 28 weeks, but particularly those born below 25, we know from many years of data that these babies have the best chance of a favourable outcome when they are inborn in a tertiary centre, and when they are exposed to antenatal steroids and to magnesium sulfate, and when there is an experienced neonatal team who attend the birth to be there to resuscitate the baby. We know that if parents want active care, then outcomes are poorer when extremely preterm babies are born in non-tertiary hospitals, or even worst case scenario, born before arrival at hospital. So that's defined as being born at home or in transit to hospital, or in a hospital car park, either in a private car or in an ambulance, and when they're not exposed to antenatal steroids and mag-sulf. And this is just some data from our most recent cohort of outborn extremely preterm babies who were born in Victoria in 2009 to 2007. And what you can see is, when we look at the mortality rates for all live births, that the odds ratio, or the risk of infant mortality, so this is death before 1 year of age, not death before discharge, is more than threefold that of inborn babies. And if we look at the babies who receive active management for those under 28 weeks, again, we still see this big difference, that they are more than 2.5 times more likely to die in the first year of life compared with babies who are inborn. We also know that outborn extremely preterm babies are at increased risk of very serious morbidity. And this is some data that I published quite a while ago now, a few years ago now. We are actually doing a study at the moment to look at if this has changed. But what we saw for these babies was, this is the 2010 to 2011 babies, that the odds of them having a very serious grade 3 or 4 intraventricular hemorrhage were 3 times that of inborn babies, and the risk of outborn babies having cystic periventricular leukomalacia was more than 5 times that, 5-fold risk compared with inborn babies. So I hope I can have convinced you that decisions made before birth are really large determinants of infant outcome. So I want to start with a little story, and this could be any hospital anywhere in Australia really. But Sarah presents to a level 3 non-tertiary maternity hospital in threatened preterm labour. She's 23 weeks gestation with a singleton male pregnancy. And the local GP obstetrician discusses the options for active or palliative care, or comfort care as it's also known, for the baby with Sarah and her partner. And of course, Sarah and her partner want to know what their baby's survival chances are, and if their baby will have any long-term problems if they decide or they opt for active care. So clearly, parents need accurate information about potential infant outcomes to enable them to make really informed decisions about their baby's care prior to the baby's birth. So back in 2010, we asked ourselves the question, well, do perinatal clinicians actually have accurate perceptions of outcomes of babies born extremely preterm? And this was part of my PhD work back at the time. But what we did was we sent out an electronic survey that we developed in RedCap, and we sent it to a range of healthcare providers who were working in both tertiary and non-tertiary hospitals across Australia, so all levels of care. And we sent the survey to midwives and nurses, to neonatologists, to paediatricians, to tertiary and non-tertiary obstetricians, and to the medical and nursing staff working at our single statewide neonatal retrieval service, which is called Piper. And back then, we asked those clinicians who agreed to participate in this study, what do you think are a live-born baby's chance of survival to discharge home if the baby was either outborn in a non-tertiary maternity hospital at 24 weeks or at 28 weeks? And what about if they were inborn in a tertiary perinatal centre at 24 or at 28 weeks? Now, of course, we knew what the survival data was for this group of babies because we had the statewide data. So I will come back to this shortly. But so we knew what happened to inborn and outborn babies. And these were the data for 2001 to 2009. So these are the results, and I'll just orientate you to these graphs for those of you who may not be so familiar with looking at box and whisker plots. So in a box and whisker plot, the solid line across the middle, and can you all see my mouse there okay? Someone just say yes.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Karen. Yeah. So the middle line of each of the boxes is the median. The outer edges of the boxes are the 25th and 75th centile, and then the whiskers are the 95th and the 5th centile. So across the bottom here, we have our 4 different groups of clinicians, who are midwives and nurses, so these were tertiary and non-tertiary, our obstetricians, tertiary and non-tertiary, our tertiary centre staff, and our neonatal transport team. And we knew at the time that the true rate of survival for outborn 24-week babies at the time was 37%. But as you can see, across all professional craft groups, they all underestimated survival quite significantly for babies who are outborn. So then we thought, surely people will have better perceptions of what happens to inborn babies. But again, what we saw was that, in fact, people underestimated survival for the inborn 24-week babies. We thought, surely people will be better at estimating survival in babies born at 28 weeks. So at the time, the true survival rate for the outborn 28-week babies was 96%. They really do quite well. But again, you can see that across all professional groups, and here's our tertiary centre staff, who again really underestimated what the chances of survival were even at 28 weeks. And surprisingly, we also saw that for inborn babies, and I should point out these little dots are the outliers, so a little couple of people who fell outside the box and whisker plots. We then asked the same group of people about their perceptions of major disability in survivors. And so that people were really clear what we meant by major disability, the words we used were, what do you think are the chances of major problems with thinking, walking, talking, and seeing in a surviving baby who was outborn in a non-tertiary hospital at 24 or at 28 weeks, or inborn in a tertiary perinatal centre at 24 or at 28 weeks? And what we saw was really quite surprising. So here was the true rate, the red dotted line, the true rate of major disability in outborn 24-week babies, which was 33% at the time. But you can see that people estimated that the baby's chance of surviving with major disability were more like about 70% or even higher. And we saw the same pattern for inborn babies. So again, here's our true rate, but here is what all craft groups perceived actually happened to these babies. We again looked at what people thought at 28 weeks, so the true rate of major disability in outborn 28-week survivors was 16.5%, But again, across all craft groups, the median value was more around 50%. And again, the same pattern for inborn babies. And these results really led us to ask at the time, well, what are we telling the parents of extremely preterm babies if people really underestimate survival and overestimate the risks of major disability? So fast forward 10 years and Lex Doyle said to me, Rose, I think we should do this survey again, and we should actually look at to see whether people's perceptions of outcome are more accurate than they were a decade ago, and what sort of changes have occurred over time in people's perceptions of infant outcome. So once again, we did a survey in REDCap, and once again, we sent it out to a wide range of multidisciplinary healthcare professionals in tertiary and non-tertiary hospitals all across Victoria. So again, midwives, nurses, neonatologists, paediatricians, obstetricians, and our retrieval team staff. And this time we wanted to narrow it down a little bit because we were very interested at the time we were developing the extreme prematurity guideline for Victoria, which specifically looked at management of babies born extremely preterm, but really before 25 weeks. So this time we asked the participants, what do you think are a baby's chances of survival to 1 year if live born and actively managed, if they were outborn in a non-tertiary hospital at 23, 24 or 25 weeks, or if they were inborn in a tertiary perinatal centre at 23, 24 or 25 weeks. And the second question we asked them was, what do you think are the chances of a baby surviving with major neurodevelopmental disability at school age, so not at 2 to 3 years, but at school age, in the survivors who were outborn at 22, 23 or 24 weeks, 23, 24 or 25 weeks, or inborn at those same gestational ages. And this time we really clearly defined what we meant by major neurodevelopmental disability. So we made it clear that we meant that this was defined as an intelligent quotient less than 2 standard deviations relative to term-born controls, moderate or severe cerebral palsy, deafness or blindness requiring hearing aids or worse. So we wanted to be really clear to people what we meant by major neurodevelopmental disability. So here was the results. So we had a really wide range of people who participated, ranging from consultants and registrars and fellows and specialist obstetricians. We had nurse educators, we had nurse, all sorts. So we felt we had a really good representation from all the different craft groups. So the first thing we found was that once again, that survival was underestimated by a mean difference of minus 14.4% from the true value. And what we saw was across all gestational age groups that people underestimated survival. We saw that underestimation was seen at all gestational ages, that underestimates of survival were higher for outborn babies compared to inborn babies, that there was actually no difference in prediction or survival estimates between tertiary or non-tertiary clinicians, so they were equally as good or as bad in their estimates. But paediatricians in our non-tertiary hospitals were actually less pessimistic than all other professions, and that midwives and nurses were the most pessimistic. And this, of course, worried me, being a neonatal nurse. And just to, again, show you the data, and I've just done it again in box plots so that you're familiar with using that. This time we've got a few extra groups because we separated out the tertiary and the non-tertiary obstetricians to see if there was a difference. And this is what we saw. So here we have the perceptions of survival. If you're outborn at 23 weeks, at the time the true rate was 50%, but you can see across all craft groups or all professional groups, again, underestimated survival for outborn babies and also underestimated survival for inborn babies at 23 weeks. What about at 24 weeks? A little bit of difference there, but again, the true rate, 38%, and a bit of variation in people's predictions. And again, the same for inborn babies. Most people underestimating survival for inborn 24-week babies. For the 25-week babies, again, a very similar pattern. What about their perceptions of major disability? Well, overall, across all craft groups, major disability was overestimated by a mean difference of 32.7% higher than the true value. And again, when we looked at this, we saw this difference across all gestational age groups, so across 23, 24, 25, inborn and outborn, but all professional groups overestimated rates of major disability in these babies. We saw that overestimation of major disability was higher with lower gestational ages, and that overestimates of major disability were higher for inborn babies higher for outborn babies compared with inborns. That again, there wasn't much difference in major disability estimates between tertiary and non-tertiary clinicians. The paediatricians were once again less pessimistic than all other professions. And unfortunately, that the nurses and midwives, again, were the most pessimistic. And so again, if we look at the box and whisker plots, here we have the true rate of major disability in these survivors at school age. But you can see again that people once again really grossly overestimated the risk of major disability. And this is our 23-week outborn and inborn. At 24 weeks, we saw people all overestimated the risks of major disability for both outborn and inborn. And at 25 weeks, again, we saw exactly the same pattern. So when we then compared the results from our 2010 survey with our 2020 survey, what we found was that people's ability to predict infant outcome was actually worse than it was a decade ago. So we saw that people's ability to predict survival was worse, and people's ability to predict major disability was worse. And so this led us to ask again, well then, now what are we telling the parents of these extremely preterm babies? And what was my take-home messages from this? Well, I thought to myself, if clinicians are underestimating survival and really overestimating the risk of major disability in the surviving infants, does this translate into overly pessimistic counselling of parents? And are parents making decisions about withholding or providing intensive care for their baby based on really inaccurate prognostication of their baby's outcome? So let's consider this story. Sarah presents to the non-tertiary level 3 maternity hospital at 23 weeks with a singleton male pregnancy. And the GP obstetrician needs to counsel these parents about management options, so whether to provide active or palliative comfort care for this baby. The GP needs to counsel them about the potential infant outcomes, so both survival and risk of major disability if the baby was offered active care. But where does this GP go to find this local, up-to-date outcome data to counsel these parents? Well, he could trot off to his local library and try and wade his way through a multitude of different studies that have been published by many different groups over the years to try and figure out for this particular individual baby what the chances of survival and major disability might be. The clinician could go and look at some of the international data on these survivors, but one of the issues here is this is the survivors for babies who do make it to be admitted to NICU. And you can see across the world, just when I've picked 5 groups here, there's quite a variation in outcome depending on what country you are born in. Of course, they could go to the ANZNN and try and figure out for babies born under 24 weeks, what's the chance of major disability? But the problem with all these data is they don't differentiate between inborn and outborn, male or female, and important other factors like whether or not the baby has been exposed to antenatal steroids. So I just want to really highlight the importance of understanding or knowing your denominator when you're interpreting infant outcome data. And I want to use the example of the 23-week babies who were born in Victoria in 2009 to 2017. So this was all live births, free of lethal anomaly. So we had 260 live births in Victoria over that time period. So if I use the denominator of survival for all the NICU admitted babies, then you could say that more than 50% of these babies, these 23-week babies, survive. That's a pretty good survival rate. But if I actually look at the survival rate for all the babies who are actively managed, the true survival rate is actually 50%. And this is because not all actively managed babies actually make it to NICU. Some of these babies are actively resuscitated in the delivery room, but then die in the delivery room despite attempts to resuscitate them. So they don't get transferred ex utero, they don't get admitted to NICU. If I take down the denominator to all live births, the survival rate at 23 weeks was actually 22.7%. And if I look at all births, so the stillbirths and the live births, then the true survival rate, if you're born at 23 weeks, is 12.5%. So be really careful when you're interpreting and also talking to parents about outcome data, that you're very clear what your denominator is when you're reporting survival rates. So one of the things we asked back again a decade ago was should or could we use the NICHD calculator to predict outcome for babies who were born in Victoria? And many of you will be familiar with the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development Extremely Preterm Birth Outcome tool. It's freely available on the internet. You can pop into this website and you enter the baby's gestational age, their birth weight, their sex, if they're male or female, singleton, yes or no, and whether or not they have been exposed to antenatal steroids. And you click submit and it generates an outcome for you. So the NICHD outcome predictor would tell us if you were born at 23 weeks and you were male, singleton, didn't get steroids, and an estimated birth weight of about 520 grams, that your chance of survival with active treatment would be 20%. So we were very interested in whether we could actually use the NICHD calculator for babies who were born in Victoria. So what we did, or I did, was I entered the data for 128 babies who were born in Victoria from one of the VIX cohorts into the calculator. And then I looked at what the calculator predicted their outcome would be with the actual outcomes of these babies at 24 months of corrected age. And we looked at the performance of the calculator in predicting both survival and the risk of survival with major disability by constructing ROC, or receive operating characteristic curves. And we looked at how the calculator performed in predicting mortality to 2 years of age for both inborn and outborn babies, and the combined outcome of death or survival with major disability. Now, I should point out one of the limitations of the NICHD calculator is that the data are all based on inborn babies. They do not have any outborns in their calculator. So what did we find? Well, the calculator actually was fairly good, quite accurate at predicting mortality for inborn babies with an area under the curve of 0.8. But it was really inaccurate for predicting mortality in outborns, which wasn't surprising, given that the calculator does not include outborn babies. So what we found was, yep, it was accurate in predicting death in inborns. It was certainly not precise for predicting death in outborns. And it overestimated the combined outcome of death or survival with major disability. So the NICHD predicted that it would be 72% overall, whereas the actual rate in Victoria at the time was 61% in inborns and 60% in outborns. And so we concluded that really people could not use the NICHD calculator in Victoria to accurately predict infant outcomes other than death in inborns. So what we realised was what was clearly needed was a local, reliable, really readily accessible tool to accurately predict outcome in extremely preterm outborn and inborn babies. And so what I set about doing was to develop a digital tool, and I called it NIC Predict because the tool will predict outcome if intensive care, or NIC, is offered to babies born extremely preterm. So what were our aims in trying to develop this tool? Well, we wanted to develop a tool that would predict 3 mutually exclusive infant outcomes, being death within the first year of life, survival free of major disability at 8 years, and survival with major disability at 8 years. And we very deliberately chose 8 years as our endpoint, not 3 or 2 or 5, because we know that when you assess children at 2 to 3 years, that does not predict what they're going to be like at 8 years of age. So it was really important that we wanted to look at what these children would be like at school age. It had to be based on local, contemporary infant outcome data. We needed a tool that was readily available 24/7 and really easy and intuitive to use, and that it had to be individualised according to a baby's risk factors. And importantly, that it could be used before birth, because when we're counselling parents before birth about infant outcomes, this is really what we want our tool to be able to do for us. And with the help of Dr. Jubal John, who's a very clever neonatologist from the Royal Women's in Melbourne, Jubal helped us to develop the actual app and the website with his brilliant coding skills. And so you can jump into Nick Predict. It is available on the App Store and on Google Play for your phones for free. And it is also available as a secure website, and you can see the web address down here at the bottom. So how did we, what's the algorithm behind it? Well, what we did for the survival data was we took a whole of population cohort. So this was every single baby who was live born in Victoria between 2009 and 2017 who were offered active care from birth. And we defined active care as a baby who received resuscitation interventions in the delivery room above and beyond just some stimulation and or oxygen. So these were babies who there was a clear intent to provide resuscitation at birth. And the survivors were alive at 1 year of age. The major disability data were derived from 3 Victorian infant collaborative study cohorts, so babies who, survivors who were assessed at 8 years of corrected age in the 1991, 1997 and 2005 Victorian infant collaborative study cohort, so there was 500 children. Sorry, going backwards there. So the first thing we looked at was what variables were independently associated with death before 1 year in actively managed extremely preterm babies. And what we found was the variables that predicted outcome were being outborn, gestational age, being male, and not being exposed to antenatal corticosteroids. In our prediction model, being a singleton or a multiple actually was not predictive or was not independently associated with death before 1 year. So these were the 4 factors that mattered: where you were born, your gestational age, if you were male or female, and whether or not you received antenatal steroids. And many times the obstetricians have said to me, Rose, what about being small for gestational age or being growth restricted? And multiple times we ran SGA or through our model, and to create a variable for SGA or for fetal growth restriction, what we did was we took the baby's birth weight Z scores, and if their birth weight Z score was more than 3 standard deviations from the mean, then we classified that as being small for gestational age. As you can see, being SGA was not predictive of death before 1 year, so SGA does not feature in the model. So this is what the web page looks like. So you come into Nick Predict, it has the baby's gestational age across the top, whether they're male or female, whether or not they've received steroids, and whether or not they are inborn, outborn. So when a clinician or when a woman presents in threatened preterm labour, the clinician just enters the 4 risk factors for that baby. Now, if sex is unknown, and there'll certainly be many times where prior to birth sex is not known, then entering male will give you the lower estimates of survival chances, and entering female will give you the upper estimates. So at least you can still say to the parents, you know, if these are the 2 ranges of survival based on whether this baby is a boy or a girl. So let's go back to Sarah's story. So you recall Sarah had presented to a level 3 non-tertiary maternity hospital at 23 weeks with a singleton male pregnancy. And the GP obstetrician is discussing the management options with Sarah and her partner. Option 1 is no active care, in which case there is only one outcome, and that is death. If you do not offer active care at 23 weeks, a baby simply cannot survive. The second option is to stay at the level 3 and birth there with a plan for active care, so resuscitation at birth, and then a plan for ex utero transfer via NETS or Piper or your local retrieval team. Plus or minus giving some antenatal corticosteroids and magnesium sulfate before the baby's born, or transferring Sarah in utero to a tertiary centre, providing antenatal steroids, and a plan for active care at the tertiary centre if the baby is live born. So the clinician jumps into Nick Predict and he enters that this is a 23-week baby. We know in this case that the baby is male. At this point has not been given antenatal steroids and at this point is going to be outborn. And the calculator then predicts 3 mutually exclusive outcomes for that baby. So these 3 numbers will always add up to 100%. So the risk or the chance of death within the first year for this baby, outborn, male, no steroids, will be 73%. Survival free of major disability, 18%, and survival with major disability, 9%. So after counselling, parent Sarah and her partner opt for active care. Sarah is given antenatal steroids and Magsol, and she's transferred in utero to a tertiary perinatal centre with a NICU. And of course, now these parents need updated information about how their baby's survival chances or long-term disability risk has changed. So once again, the data are entered into NIC Predict. So now we have a 23-week baby still. He's still male, we can't change that. But now the baby has been exposed to antenatal steroids and he's now going to be inborn. So now we can see that the chance of death within the first year has dropped from 73% down to 44%. The chance of survival free of major disability is now 37%, and survival with major disability, 19%. So Sarah is transferred to the tertiary centre, and happily her contractions settle and she stays on bed rest. But at 25 and 4 weeks, she ruptures her membranes and starts contracting. Antenatal corticosteroids are administered again, and now the team at that NICU need to go and update these parents about this baby's potential outcomes. So once again, they enter the data into NIC Predict. So now Sarah's baby is 25 weeks, he's still male, can't change that, but exposed to steroids and going to be inborn. And now you can see the chance of death within 1 year has dropped again to 19%. So just to remind you, if he was outborn no steroids, the chance of death was 73%. If he was outborn with steroids, the chance of death was 44%. But getting this baby to 25 weeks, inborn and steroids, the chance of death has now dropped to 19%. So what do we perceive as some of the benefits of using NIC Predict? Well, importantly, it provides predictions of infant outcome before the baby is born. It's individualised for each baby based on their particular risk factors. It's based on local contemporaneous outcome data from Victoria, and it allows clinicians to give parents really accurate information about how outcomes improve with some perinatal interventions provided before birth. So steroids in utero transfer. And birth, of course, in a tertiary centre with NICU facilities on site. So where are we going next? Well, at the moment, I'm just getting the data for the babies who were born in 2018 through to the end of 2021, and then we will be able to update the survival algorithm for those babies. Over the next 2 years, we will start assessing at 8 years of corrected age, the VIX 2016-27 cohort, who will all turn 8 next year and the year after. And so then we'll be able to update the major disability data in the algorithm. And we're currently evaluating the effect of the introduction of NIC Predict on improving clinicians' ability to accurately predict outcome in these babies. So at the moment, I'm doing the analysis on the most recent study to see whether using NIC Predict has resulted in a more accurate perception of infant outcomes. But I'd like to finish today just with a really important message, and I've thanked Professor Jeannie Chong, who worked with me closely on this project, and these slides are actually from Jeannie. But what is really important to appreciate is that outcomes for extremely preterm babies change rapidly with increasing postnatal age, with each day of survival, and with the occurrence of some really important prognostic postnatal events. So what Jeannie has shown, again, this is from the VIC study, is that with increasing gestational age at birth or days of postnatal survival, the probability of death decreases and the chance of survival without major disability increases. So I'm just going to show you this. So here is the conditional probability of death. And as we go through, this will be admitted to NICU day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 28, and discharge. So what you'll see is for each day that the baby survives in the NICU journey and for each extra week of gestational age, that the chances or the probability of death go down with each day that the baby is alive. We see exactly the same pattern with the conditional probability of survival with major disability. And again, if we look at the probability of survival without major disability, for every postnatal day that the baby survives, the probability of survival without major disability increases. Jeannie also showed that in survivors, the risk of major disability was associated with the occurrence of 4 important postnatal events. So if the baby had a grade 3 or grade 4 IVH, if they had cystic periventricular leukomalacia, if they required postnatal corticosteroids, or if they had surgery in the neonatal period. And what Jeannie showed was that survival without major disability changed according to whether you had none of these important 4 prognostic events or whether you had 1, 2, or 3 or more. So what implications does this have for parent counselling and decision making? Well, long-term prognosis in terms of death and major disability changes rapidly after birth for extremely preterm babies. And therefore, counselling of families and post-discharge planning should be individualised to changing circumstances following the baby's birth. So my final thoughts today, or my take-home messages for you, are please be really clear about what the denominator is when you're counselling parents about survival chances. If you're counselling just on survival chances on your NICU, remember that not all babies make it to a NICU despite receiving active care. If you're developing outcome predictors, then you really need to adjust for perinatal risk factors such as birthplace, sex, and antenatal corticosteroids, and that it's really important to counsel parents throughout their baby's NICU stay as baby's outcomes change with each postnatal day of survival and each day that the baby survives free of those 4 important postnatal events. And I think no need to convince you all, but when you are developing outcome predictors, one size does not fit all for a baby born at 23 weeks or 24 weeks. So I'd just like to acknowledge this work was done with funding from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and also the CRE for Excellence in Newborn Medicine. And I really do need to thank Professor Lex Doyle and Jeannie Chong, who have been my postdoc supervisors for a number of years now and have supported me with doing all this research and continue to support me. And to Jubal John, our fantastic brains behind the app development. But also to the Department of Health in Victoria, who support me by providing me with access to all the perinatal data for the state. And lastly, just to acknowledge the Victorian Infant Collaborative Study Group, who spend so much of their time and effort in following up these children through to childhood, to school age and beyond, across all our tertiary units, and this wouldn't be possible without them. So I'm going to stop there. I want to leave at least 15 minutes for questions, and I can see there's already 10 in the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing there. But yes, you can follow me on Twitter, and please don't hesitate to email me there at rose.boland at MCRI if you have any questions about this work or need predict, etc. So I'll stop sharing. And
thank you. Thank you so much, Rose. That is so fascinating. Having done my PhD on neurodevelopmental outcomes, so fascinated by all of this. But you are correct, there are a lot of questions in the chat. So please, if anybody wants to ask questions in person, just raise your hand. I'll watch the screen, but I'll start working my way down the very huge number of questions. And the first one is from Julie, talking about, can NIC Predict be customized to local data, e.g. from Japan, Indonesia, or even New South Wales?
Okay, so when I was at Kazan's, Mary Sharp from WA said, oh gosh, Rose, we'd love to validate this for WA because, and we suspect that because, for example, Western Australia has a higher proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies, that we might have to, well, we'd have to put all the data into the algorithm and then redo the calculations for that group of babies. It is the same with New South Wales. We would have to put the data into the algorithm and also see what factors were predictive in New South Wales. one of the challenges is that New South Wales and WA don't collect data on 8 years at corrected age. They both only go as far as 5 years. So that would be the other consideration, that the predictions would be to 5 years, not to 8. But yes, that's certainly something I was discussing just with Lex and Jeannie yesterday. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks. The next question is from Krista Wacaldo from RPA, and she says she notices that ASD is not a major outcome. Why was that choice made?
Okay. For this one, for major disability, we didn't do autistic spectrum disorder. We just looked at the ones that are defined for major disability for comparison with most international cohorts. And the definition we use for major disability is one that's been used fairly consistently for that. So, yeah, we didn't look at autism.
Krista, did you want to add anything to your question there? Welcome to unmute if you want.
There we go. I thank you. Actually, I'll let you see me as well, which may not help. Look, I was just wondering, because of the changing landscape in neurodevelopment and the many more autistic children that we see, and it's really a lifelong issue for them. So I was wondering whether at some stage in the future you guys might actually add that into your algorithm, because certainly from a clinical point of view, it occupies us very many days of the year.
Sure. Yep. So great, Krista. Thanks. Yep.
Great. The next question is from Yulia, who's asking, according to the calculator, the survival with major disability at 23 weeks was 19% and at 25 weeks, 20%. Why is that?
So Yulia, for all the outcomes, it adds up 3 mutually exclusive outcomes. So it's not that babies were more likely to survive with major disability. It's because when you add up the 3 outcomes, less babies survive at 23 weeks to then have major disability. Does that make sense? You don't look at each. You don't look at each of the 3 outcomes as a single. You look at the 3 outcomes because they're mutually exclusive. They add up to 100%. So it will be because fewer babies survived at 23 weeks. Sorry, to be disabled, if you like. So if you go back and have a look at it, go and put a 23-week baby into the calculator or a 25-week baby, and then it will make sense what that means.
Thanks, Rose.
That very well.
Yeah. I think that was quite good. And Kurt, I'm very glad I'm going to unmute yourself and ask your question, because I looked at the very long question in the chat. So please ask away.
Thanks, Karen. Rose, that was great, and your app and how you designed that for your local population is an absolute peach, how that helps, like you described in your example of a GP. A GP can do counseling on this topic. That is absolutely amazing. I think my question goes a little bit further into, are we doing a lot of benchmarking? And benchmarking is between centers. You already highlighted, oh, no, wait a minute, this data is not the same. But when we look at our benchmarking data, the data we collect is only mortality or neurodevelopmental impairment, etc. But it doesn't describe decision sharing and those moments, how often we actually create those moments and how often we actually offer those moments. And the simplest example I always find is maybe an IVH, severe IVH. If you offer redirection of care, that a baby indeed won't survive. So it comes into the mortality basket, but doesn't come in the neurodevelopmental basket. So I was just wondering your opinion on that, how we can, streamline that particular aspect in the difficulties of benchmarking.
Yeah, I think thanks, Kurt. That's a great question. And I think that is one of the challenges when you sort of read through, any reports of outcome data, that it's reporting those outcomes separately. And coming back to the shared decision making, one of the really big challenges, and this has been one of the big challenges for me in this research, is we don't actually know what parents are being told. And in fact, we've got a student looking at that at the moment, actually trying to look at what parents recall being told and would they have changed their decision making had they known what the potential outcomes might have been. I think my answer is I don't know how to answer your question, to be honest. I don't know how we fix it other than by using predictors like this, actually developing tools for individual babies. I think perhaps that is the answer. I can't see any other way of doing it, because when you've just got those, death or major disability in tables, it doesn't account for inborn, outborn, steroids, no steroids. It's just every baby all in one table together. And as we know, they're all very, very different. And I hope I've shown that they're not the same. Inborn, outborn, survival and disability is not the same as an inborn baby.
Yeah, now I wonder if it makes sense to separate. Of course, we don't have the data big enough yet to separate between always active care, or not.
Yeah. Might have to take that offline with you and have a further thought about that one. Yeah. And I see the second question: how can severe SGA not affect mortality? We put it, Kurt, into the predictor, and I've done it over and over and over and over. So prior to
I understand for the bigger babies, but for a 23-weeker who then becomes 400 grams.
Yep. So at the end of the day, so yes, there's no doubt those babies don't do as well, but in terms of independently predicting mortality, it does not ever come out for pre-birth prediction in the calculator. And we've done it over and over and over and over, because the obstetricians just won't believe us.
Interesting. I think that answers the next question too, about why the SGA, the impact of the SGA on mortality and disability. So in the interest of time, I might come down. Did multiple pregnancy come across as a risk, not come across as a risk factor?
So that was an interesting one, Rajesh, because the NICHD calculator certainly has multiple birth as a risk factor. Again, we put it in, we have done this, we've got 30 years of every single baby born in Victoria. We have done these calculations over and over, and with different modelling. And for this particular model, multiple pregnancy was not a risk factor that was independently associated with death before 1 year in these babies. What mattered was outborn, male, no steroids. Gestational age, yeah.
And another question, Shrini has put on a paper on ASD data and preterm infants, which he says might be useful, so that's very helpful. Any other questions? I think I've come to the end of the questions in the chat, and we have a few more minutes. Please
just can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Hi, this is Scott. Just want to ask, was there enough representation of IUGR at 23 or 24 weeks to make this meaningful outcome that IUGR doesn't affect?
So do you mean, do we have enough babies to power the calculation?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well, it was every baby born in the state. So this was a couple of thousand babies. So yes, it wasn't just, I would have to go back and have a look at how many were SGA by the variable that we created for SGA. I haven't got that just off the top of my head.
Sure,
but
sure.
I can certainly go back and look at it. And of course, then when we're going to have the next 3 years of data, we will then have even more babies in that data set. And again, we'll redo the predictions again and see if the same factors still come out for the most recent group of babies born in 2018 to 2021.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Batnal. Any more questions? I don't think so. How long did it take you to develop the app, Rose?
Well, I didn't develop that. That was Jubal's. So we just did the data and the calculations. This was this has been years of work. I think is fair to say, and continues to be. It will continue to be years of work because it's going to be a living tool. Sorry, that's just my little.
Oh,
just
we've lost
1 sec.
Yeah.
Parent talk.
Oh, okay. Great. Well, I will talk now. In fact, Julie, you could maybe tell us who is going to be speaking next week.
Can I have? Oh, has she gone? I was going to ask one more question whether she could
she's coming back. No, she's coming back.
Right.
But
okay, I was going to ask her one more question about whether she could. Can I ask you one more question about whether you could sell it to other states, countries? Let them put their own data in. The business person in me.
Yeah. So first of all, Julie, at the moment, it's not something that we sell. It is available for free. It may well be in time to sustain it that we may need to look at more of a commercialization and have a fee for download for either an area health service or for an individual clinician. But that's something that's sort of further down the track.
Because at the moment, your data that's input into it is a Victorian-based data, right? So it's not applicable to many places. So I guess to make use of your algorithm, we can input data from a local source into it.
Yeah.
So and then you can charge us and go on holiday to Hawaii. Right. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, I'll start working on
that. There you
go. Yes, but we have talked about, I've talked with the business development team at EMS about commercialization, but what we really wanted to do was, in the first instance, this was really about providing a tool for clinicians in Victoria to help them when they're counselling parents to be able to give accurate data. It wasn't about making mega bucks in the first instance. So yeah.
You were on the mission for good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Hawaii holiday is calling.
And then and then we so we're just looking at the moment, just doing the analysis on seeing whether having Nick Predict has helped clinicians. So just analysing that data at the moment. So watch this space for the next part of this talk and then the updates. And I guess one of the criticisms of Nick Predict early on was that people said, oh, the disability data is too old. The cohorts are from 1991, 2005, they're too old. What Lex Doyle has shown, and we've written a paper on this as well, is that in fact, major disability rates have not followed the same trajectory as survival has. So while survivors have gone up over the years, major disability rates really actually haven't changed that much. But of course, we will have the 2016-2017 VIX cohort 8-year data soon, and therefore that will go into the algorithm, and then hopefully that will keep people happy.
Yeah. Right. Robert Garan's put into the chat, he's taking an opportunity to notify colleagues there's a survey being done as part of a reviewing the marketing of infant formula. Okay. Thank you, Robert.
Great.
Excellent.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Robert. Very useful. So there is a survey there. The marketing of infant formula, a very important topic that maybe we should consider one time, Julie, to have some speakers on this. Fascinating.
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah. Robert,
there's a lot of...
You're putting your hand up for it?
Oh, Robert could. There's a lot of work being done globally on the phenomenal amount of money being spent on marketing of infant formula. It's more than the budget of the World Health Organization. Fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
Absolutely.
Okay, Robert's volunteered. All right. Robert's okay. All right. We're gonna have a bit of a break because PAS is on, Easter is here, and the school holiday. So we'll take a break. But we'll come back in May. The first one that's scheduled is David Gathera, one of Karen's friends from Kenya, who will speak about the challenges of nursing care in low and middle income countries. Squeeze in between, I will try to get Vinny Bandari from Cooper Health in New York to talk about how we can extubate, or who can we select to extubate for our very tiny babies, baby population. So predicting who will survive extubation. All right.
And let me just add, David works for the London School of Health and Tropical Medicine as well, and for Nest 360. So he's doing a lot of work on innovation on neonatal practice in Africa. So it will be really interesting.
Right.
So Robert, I think, has volunteered to speak for the next one. So all good. Okay.
I'm just sharing my final slide there, everyone. So I'm just sharing that final slide. So if anyone wants to contact me for further information, there's my contact details. Or of course you can also contact me, rose.boland@health.newsouthwales.gov.au.
And I would just...
Much, Rose. Amazing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose. Fantastic talk. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks.
Have a happy Easter.
Bye.
Bye.
This is not attendant.